I'm not sure if you have noticed, but the level of skepticism and mistrust of reporters and our reporting has increased, not just here, but in most countries. Some would say that is to be expected in countries where governments control the media, but what about countries like here or in other Western democracies where we have allowed the government to control the conversation, set the narrative, where our lack of questioning and our assumption going into our questioning, is too often, first, that there is a moral ground, and second, that we somehow stand on it. I cover Pakistan and Afghanistan, but have also covered the Central Asian republics, Yemen, Iran, Northern Iraq, and in 2006, covered the war in South Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. My friend and colleague, Anya Niederinghaus, who died in last year's shooting, and I were the first Western reporters to embed with the Afghan army. We told of an undertrained, poorly equipped army that were ill-prepared to take on the country's security on their own. They complained about the inadequate training that most often lasted 4 weeks, occasionally, for officers, 8 weeks. It wasn't enough, they said. Despite their honesty about their shortcomings, their US trainers and Afghan government officials dismissed their complaints as Afghan griping. We did the stories at a time when the US and coalition narrative was about the money being invested and the goal of getting 350,000 Afghan boots on the ground and the successes of getting there. It was frustrating to try to get attention focused on what the Afghans were saying. Today, as they die in large numbers, their inexperience killing them, their competence is being questioned. Yet the conversation about the why of their incompetence is murky, with few difficult questions being posed about the quality of the training. And the reason for that is because we have allowed the conversation and narrative to originate in Washington, and we, as journalists, respond to the conversation, to that conversation. Our questions reflect that conversation. As a result, as the US unveils plans to train the Kurds, there is little to no conversation about the quality of the training. The reporters posing the questions, it would appear, haven't entertained the thought that there might be a problem with the training. The assumption is that the difficulty is in either choosing the good recruits from among the local population or their ability to digest the training and make it work for them. This assumption that the US training is good influences our questions, limits our abilities to be probing. In fact, if you put a new US recruit through the same limited training given the Afghans or the Kurds, would you get a good soldier, or would you get a frightened, poorly trained man or woman in a uniform too easily killed due to inexperience? As journalists, our job is to inform, and it comes with a price. That price isn't only about facing danger. It is also about choosing to dig deeper, asking tough questions, researching and understanding your subject. It is about refusing to be intimidated and having the courage, excuse me, to step away from that good versus evil precipice that has tainted reporting and impacted how stories and conflicts are covered. Let me use the topic of press freedom to explain my point, because how we do our job and how we are allowed to do our job defines a free press. The topic of press freedom is a tricky one. It sounds simple enough, and certainly something we all can embrace and should embrace. But I am not so sure we are all on the same page when it comes to the definition of press, and by extension, press freedom. It is different from media, because media can mean everything from journalism to advertising to social media. Press freedom, for me, is very simple. It is all about the right to do our job and the right of the public to know. It is not about being an advocate, a torchbearer of human rights, or some vaguely laid out set of values that is so often linked to the West as if we have a monopoly on all that is good and right. We as journalists are not crusaders, champions, or guardians of anything but the right to ask questions, investigate, understand, and disseminate information. I believe there is an important distinction between, say, press freedom and freedom of expression and freedom of speech. I don't see them as one and the same. Press freedom is about access to information, the public's right to know, and the freedom of the press to pursue information and publish it without fear of interference, prosecution, or retaliation. Freedom of speech or expression, that's different. Important, but different. While it might not be possible to have one without the other, there still remains a difference. As journalists, photographers, and videographers, we are the press, and we have a job to do. And whether we are able to do that job depends greatly on a government's commitment, respect, and protection of a free press. It also depends on the ethics, honesty, and competence of the press itself. While a free press might be widely championed, in practice, not so much. Canada, for example, had a rule for photographers embedded with the Canadian military. In Afghanistan, they were not allowed to take pictures of wounded soldiers. Why? My thinking is because they are difficult images to see, and it could have eroded public support. It would bring home the cost of war, yet those soldiers whose wounds the government did not want shown have to live every day with their injuries. Their injuries, as well as the lives lost, are the consequences of war. We had the right and responsibility to bring that information home, and the public had the right to know. Without that information, the public perception of the consequences of war could be skewed. But it is not limited to coverage of wars alone. Here in the United States, the Justice Department took countless phone records of the Washington-based Associated Press reporters. Their action had the potential to compromise sources, effectively prevent the free press from doing its job. As the AP story at the time said, this Justice Department secretly obtained 2 months of telephone records of reporters and editors for the Associated Press, in which the News Cooperative's top executive called a massive and unprecedented intrusion into how news organizations gathered the news. The Justice Department did not even notify AP of the confiscation of telephone records. In a separate incident, the FBI planted a false story claiming to be AP. Using national security as a rationale for controlling or interfering with the press is a fool's argument. A reporter's freedom is not about whether images are too graphic or whether reports involve national security, threats, or dangers. Press freedom is about the right to know, and it is also about honesty and accurately chronicling history. At the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner this year, US President Barack Obama said the press's relationship with the government was adversarial. He was wrong. We are not adversaries, partners, or advocates. I cringe when I hear reporters talking about our troops. We are separate, independent. That does not make us adversaries. The government's attempts to control, manipulate, or outright lie, that is what makes us adversaries. Like governments, the press itself has a great deal of introspection and soul-searching to do. The press has a credibility problem, in part because of 24-hour television news channels that have blurred the line between information and entertainment, social media, so-called citizen journalists, Twitter, all have served to cloud the public's perception of the press. Trust in what people read and hear has eroded, and that threatens press freedom because it is easier to attack, control, and manipulate the press when respect for the institution itself is lacking. How are we to blame? Sadly, in many ways. We were lazy after 9/11. At a time when we should have been the most inquisitive, we were the least. Questions that should have been asked in 2001 were asked in 2005 or 2006 when it had become acceptable to question. Patriotism, national security, fear, all combined to cloud how we looked at stories, government statements, allegations. There are those who hold that the New York Times single-handedly sold the invasion of Iraq through a series of stories that shamed the press. The stories were single-sourced, and that source was an Iraqi opposition leader, Chalabi, who just happened to have died on Tuesday, and who had everything to gain by the removal of Saddam Hussein. We accepted versions of events put out by governments that we couldn't verify. We compromised for the sake of access. We were not always independent witnesses, but rather on one side or the other. The Taliban were evil rather than a combatant in a conflict. It colored our stories, limited our questioning, which had we from the outset questioned, we might have investigated the Afghans with whom the coalition allied itself and learned that their brutality matched that of the Taliban, and in some cases was even more brutal. Let me tell you a story of when the Taliban fell in November 2001. I was the only journalist allowed into Kabul by the Taliban during the bombing by the US-led coalition to oust them. When they did flee the city, I was already there, had been there for more than 3 weeks. As hundreds of journalists rushed into the city, one BBC journalist famously said he was liberating Kabul. I got into Afghanistan because of AP's remarkable staff, local staff, and my contacts that came from years of covering the Taliban, going to front lines, engaging with their leadership, engaging with the people. For me, it was a dream to be allowed in during the bombing, to tell the stories of those living through those attacks. When my colleagues arrived, after the Taliban had fled from Kabul, there were some among them that were accusatory. How had I been able to get in? Their questions suggested I had compromised. How could such a misogynistic, evil group like the Taliban let me in? Had I gone easy on them? Did I like them? I was stunned, and then I was outraged. Had they been jealous of my great contacts that I had gotten in, then I would have understood it. After all, they had all been trying, some even wearing burqas to try to get in. But no, they were accusatory. What was happening? We are journalists. We are supposed to have good contacts. I don't care, Taliban, President Hamid Karzai, the United States, we are supposed to have great contacts. I did all the stories about women's rights being stomped on, Taliban affiliations, Arab militants in the country. That there should be suspicion because you have contacts with all sides in a conflict is to me mind-boggling and a little scary. Coverage is often skewed depending on who is allied with the US and with the Western countries. Taliban treatment of women was horrible. But did you know Saudi Arabia has more repressive legislation directed at women than any other country in the world? And still, the UN named Saudi Arabia to its Human Rights Council. Did you know Saudi Arabia weekly publicly beheads convicted criminals? These criminals are given their defense lawyers, their trials are secret, and there is no appeal. Saudi Arabia has funded extremist Sunni Muslim groups in many parts of the world, where the local populations now suffer their wrath. President Bush, however, called Saudi Arabia Washington's moderate Muslim ally in the Middle East. There was very little questioning at the time of that statement. There were very little reports looking into the realities behind the legislations that are passed in that country and the involvement of that country in militancy. And just one last example of the distance we as journalists seem to have strayed from our one big job of asking probing questions. I was watching a seasoned reporter, respected, on public television interviewing a presidential candidate. Interviewing a presidential candidate. His question to the man running for president of the United States, wait for it, do you think the United States is the greatest country in the world? Thank you.